Imagine this. You're in the middle of a heated argument. Your pulse quickens. Each word feels like a bullet, sharp, personal, necessary. You line up your next sentence like it's a weapon. Ready to win. Ready to be right. But then, something strange happens. The other person stops talking. They just look at you. Calm, silent, unshaken. Suddenly, you feel exposed. Like you're swinging at shadows. Like maybe you've already lost. That's when Nietzsche steps in. Not with advice. Not with comfort. But with a whisper. You have surrendered your power the moment you try to prove it. You see, most people think power is loud. They think it's about being heard, being right, being praised. But Nietzsche, the philosopher of storms and solitude, saw it differently. To him, true power lives in restraint. In the ability to say, I don't need to argue. I know who I am. In a world addicted to instant reactions and online debates, he saw silence not as absence, but as dominance. This video isn't about shutting up. It's about waking up to the idea that the strongest move is sometimes no move at all. So the question isn't, how do I win this argument? It's, why am I arguing in the first place? If that thought made you pause, you're already closer to Nietzsche than most will ever be. What if silence isn't emptiness, but compressed power? For Friedrich Nietzsche, the essence of strength was never about dominating others with volume, arguments, or authority. Real power, he believed, begins within, in mastering your impulses, in standing still while the world pulls at you to react. We often think power means influence over people, but Nietzsche flipped that. To him, true power is influence over yourself. This was the core of his philosophy. Not brute control or social status, but the drive to rise above your lower instincts. He saw the greatest strength in the individual who resists the need to be validated, who doesn't perform to be seen, and who does not enter battles just to be right. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "He who cannot command himself shall be commanded." And isn't that what most of us do? We think we're choosing our battles when really we're being dragged into them by pride, ego, fear of being misunderstood. We argue not to speak truth, but to protect the fragile idea of who we think we are. This is the tragedy Nietzsche exposed. That most of what we call communication is actually desperation in disguise. He saw modern man trapped in noise, not just the noise of society, but the noise within, self-doubt, insecurity, the frantic need to matter. And that's where silence becomes revolutionary. Because silence, in Nietzsche's view, is never passive. It's not surrender, it's strategy. Pause with purpose. It's the mark of someone who doesn't need to play the social game, because they've already stepped outside of it. Nietzsche envisioned an ideal human, someone we might call the fully self-mastered individual. This person doesn't chase validation, doesn't jump to defend themselves, doesn't waste words. They choose when to speak, and when silence says more. Why? Because nothing reveals insecurity faster than the need to always explain, always react, always prove. And nothing displays inner strength more clearly than the refusal to be pulled out of your center. Every time you argue from emotion, you shrink your presence. Every time you react just to be seen, you surrender your power. But when you hold silence, when you stay still while others scramble, you become something else entirely. Unpredictable, unreachable, unshakable. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche warns, one must learn to be a sponge if one wants to be a philosopher. One must be able to absorb without reacting too quickly. That's what silence gives you, space. To observe before responding. To rise above the emotional battlefield before stepping onto it, or choosing not to. And that's key. Silence is only power when it's chosen. Silence born of fear is weakness. But silence born of clarity, of total self-possession, is authority in its purest form. Think of people who hold that kind of stillness. They don't have to speak to dominate a room. They listen not to respond, but to understand. They wait, not because they're unsure, but because they're in no rush to be known. Their silence speaks, and everyone listens. Nietzsche's ideal human didn't shout to be heard. They spoke with intention or not at all. Because their words had weight. And weight only comes when you don't spend them chasing attention. So the next time you feel the need to explain yourself, ask, am I speaking from strength? Or am I defending something that doesn't need to be defended? Because maybe the strongest thing you can do is say nothing. And let the silence say everything. But silence isn't just the absence of speech, it's the presence of control. You resist the pull to react, you're not just staying quiet. You're rewriting the rules of the conversation. You're creating a space that makes others uncomfortable, because in that space they face themselves. Most people are terrified of silence. They fill it with noise, over-explaining, defending, apologizing, because silence feels like a void. But to the self-mastered individual, silence isn't a void. It's leverage. It's timing. It's dominance without aggression. Nietzsche saw that the one who remains still while others scramble commands the moment. Not because they try, but because they don't. In a culture where everyone is broadcasting, those who say less are seen as holding more. Because restraint feels rare, and rarity feels valuable. So maybe the real flex isn't how quickly you can reply, but how long you can hold your ground without saying a word. Why is it so hard to stay silent? We know we shouldn't take the bait. We tell ourselves, don't respond, stay calm. And yet, the moment we feel attacked, misunderstood, or ignored, we react. Why? Because silence isn't just a decision, it's a confrontation with the ego. For most people, the urge to speak isn't about truth. It's about identity. When someone disagrees with us, it doesn't feel like they're challenging an idea. It feels like they're challenging us. This is why arguments escalate so fast. Why people yell over dinner tables, flame strangers online, or spiral into rage after a single comment. Because the brain isn't looking for truth, it's looking for survival. And to the ego, silence feels like surrender. Nietzsche understood this far before psychology gave it language. He saw that most people speak not to communicate but to defend. Not to connect but to protect. He once wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster." When we argue from ego, we're not standing up for something noble. We're standing up for our illusion of control. A mask we don't want ripped off. Modern psychology confirms Nietzsche's suspicion. Our egos are wired to protect our self-image at all costs. It's called ego defense, and it manifests as denial, projection, blame shifting, even aggression. Silence in that moment feels dangerous, because silence allows discomfort to grow, and discomfort threatens the fragile scaffolding of who we think we are. But here's the twist. The ego isn't strong, it's fragile. It shouts because it's afraid. It interrupts because it can't stand uncertainty. It argues not because it's confident, but because it's desperate to avoid feeling small. And in this desperation, we reveal ourselves. The moment you lash out to defend your intelligence, your status, your opinion, you've shown that it wasn't secure to begin with. The more reactive you are, the more power you've already given away. Nietzsche believed that the strongest individual wasn't the one who won arguments, but the one who didn't need to enter them. Because true strength isn't reactive. It's reserved. Imagine two people in a heated discussion. One is loud, flustered, constantly trying to make their point. The other listens quietly, their posture relaxed, their tone even. They say little, but when they do, it lands with precision. Who looks more powerful? We instinctively sense it, The one who doesn't need to fight for their position is often the one who holds real influence. This is why silence feels so threatening, not to the strong but to the insecure. Because silence reflects. It creates a mirror, and the other person sees their own lack of control staring back at them. And if you're the one holding that mirror, you don't need to win. You've already shifted the dynamic. This is why silence is so rarely practiced, because it demands something few people have: a sense of self that doesn't collapse when left unvalidated. To sit with silence when your name is questioned, your ideas are attacked, or your worth is doubted, requires inner architecture. It's not about being passive. It's about being anchored. Nietzsche knew that most people react not because they're courageous, but because they're afraid of not existing in the eyes of others. Afraid of being invisible. Afraid of being wrong. But the person who can stay silent, not out of fear but by choice, has already won a deeper battle. They are not driven by the urge to be seen. They are driven by something quieter, and far more dangerous: self-mastery. And in that stillness, while others scramble for significance, they hold the only thing that truly matters: control. In a world addicted to noise, silence is unsettling. It breaks patterns. It forces reflection. It shifts power without lifting a finger. To Nietzsche, silence was never weakness. It was sophistication, a decision made by someone who had nothing to prove and everything under control. The most powerful move, he believed, wasn't always action. It was restraint, elegant, invisible restraint. Think about an argument where one person is flustered, talking fast, throwing accusations, while the other simply listens. No rush, no panic, just stillness. That stillness is not emptiness. It's pressure. And pressure, when applied in silence, can be more effective than any counterattack. Most people assume power is volume, dominance, quick responses. But Nietzsche saw something else: that the one who controls their own response controls the whole interaction. He believed the truly powerful individual doesn't just withstand chaos, they shape it. And often that shaping begins not with a word, but with a pause. Modern psychology confirms this. Strategic silence, also known as intentional withholding, is a known technique in negotiation, leadership, and influence. It creates space for the other person to fill. And in that space, they often reveal more than they intended. Nietzsche mastered this intuitively. His writings, sharp and fragmentary, often left more questions than answers. But that wasn't failure, it was design. He once wrote, "It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what others say in a whole book. And what's between those sentences? Silence, invitation, challenge." Silence becomes the moment when the reader or listener confronts themselves. The same thing happens in daily life. Imagine a team meeting. 2 people are going back and forth, escalating. One interrupts, the other defends. And then, someone sits back and says nothing. The room shifts. People notice. They wonder. Their focus moves to the one who isn't playing the game. This is the beginning of silent control. On social media, it's the person who posts rarely but meaningfully. In conversation, it's the one who listens more than they speak. In arguments, it's the one who doesn't take the bait. And what makes this silence powerful isn't just the lack of sound. It's the clarity behind it. Nietzsche's ideal wasn't the loud leader or the dominant debater. It was the self-mastered individual who chooses when to speak and when to withhold, not out of fear, but because their energy is too valuable to waste. Because when you say less, people lean in. When you pause, they anticipate. And when you finally speak, your words echo longer. This is how silence works as a form of framing. It forces the other person to interpret, adapt, and even doubt their position, all while you remain anchored. But here's the critical difference. Silence is only power when it's paired with presence. Without presence, silence becomes avoidance. But with it, it becomes tension. And tension is magnetic. The greatest mistake people make is thinking that silence means doing nothing. But Nietzsche's silence is not passive. It's tactical. It's the sharpened stillness of someone who could speak, but chooses not to, not yet. Because when timing is everything, silence becomes the rhythm of influence. And those who master it, master far more than words. Silence, when mastered, is not a shield, it's a blade. Not the kind that cuts loudly, but the kind you never see coming. It disarms, it redirects, it exposes. And the brilliance of it? You don't need to fight for control, you become control. Nietzsche believed that the person who transcends the need to be right, to be understood, or to defend every opinion, is no longer a participant in the power struggle. They are its architect. In silence, people project their fears onto you. They fill the void with their own insecurity. And the longer you hold your silence, the more control you gain, not by force but by presence. So the next time you're provoked, insulted, or pulled into a pointless debate, ask yourself, is my silence louder than any answer I could give? Because sometimes the most commanding statement is the one you never make. Some people live in quiet houses, yet are surrounded by noise, not from the outside world but from within. The loudest arguments are often not with others, they're with ourselves. And Nietzsche understood this. Long before psychology had words for overthinking, imposter syndrome, or rumination, he warned of the greatest obstacle to freedom, the self that won't shut up. We tend to focus on silencing the world, critics, chaos, interruptions. But the real battle is internal, because the thoughts you don't control end up controlling you. Nietzsche called for something radical, not just silence in speech but silence in thought. This doesn't mean stopping the mind completely. It means breaking the addiction to mental noise, that endless commentary, self-judgment, fear of what might go wrong, regret over what already did. He believed that real strength isn't measured by your ability to fight others, but by your ability to master your own reactions. Reactions begin in the mind. You're not arguing with your colleague. You're arguing with the voice that says, you need to prove something. You're not upset by the insult. You're upset because it poked a wound you've been hiding from. You're not drained by the world. You're drained by the story you keep telling yourself about who you are and what you lack. This is the noise Nietzsche wanted us to confront. Because if you can't find silence within, you'll never be free, no matter how quiet the world becomes. In one of his most powerful reflections, he said, "You must be willing to burn in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes?" To become ashes is to let old identities burn, to dismantle the inner voices that cling to fear, resentment, comparison. And in that burning, what remains? Stillness. And from stillness, power. This inner silence is not a void. It's a space for transformation. It's the moment between reaction and response where choice is born. Modern neuroscience supports what Nietzsche sensed intuitively. When the brain is in constant internal chatter, rehashing the past, anticipating judgment, overanalyzing every outcome, the default mode network becomes overactive. This part of the brain is linked to self-referential thought, the me narrative that exhausts and limits us. But when we practice intentional silence, through stillness, mindfulness, or focused attention, that network quiets. And suddenly there's space, not just in the mind, but in how we see life. And it's in this space that clarity begins to form. Without that inner pause, we react on autopilot. We mistake emotion for truth. We confuse urgency with importance. Nietzsche's concept of becoming who you are requires this space. because you can't become anything if your identity is glued to mental noise. The real enemy of self-overcoming isn't the world. It's the loop inside your head that says, "This is just how I am." It's the self-image built on past pain, repeated enough times to feel like truth. But Nietzsche would challenge you. What if that voice isn't you? What if silence isn't emptiness, but a doorway? A place where your truest self isn't found, but uncovered, because the noise finally stopped long enough for you to hear it? What if your next evolution won't come from learning more, but from listening less? Not to others, but to the untrained, anxious voice inside that thinks it's you. Silencing the world is easy. Silencing the self, that's the hard part. Because that inner voice knows all your fears. It mimics your doubts. Sounds like you, but it isn't. Nietzsche's call wasn't just for rebellion against society. It was for rebellion against the internal tyrant that whispers limitations every day. The voice that says, "You're not enough." The one that panics when you don't get instant feedback. The one that overthinks every word you said, every silence you held. But once you recognize that voice as separate, once you create space between your awareness and your reaction, you become untouchable. That's the power of inner silence. It's not peace, it's presence. And in that presence, you begin to move not from fear, but from intention. Not from reaction, but from choice. Because the loudest voice in the world should never be the one that lives in your head. There's a strange truth about real power. Most people don't recognize it when they see it. They expect it to be loud, obvious, dominant. But Nietzsche knew better. He understood that true strength often wears the mask of weakness. The individual who walks away from a fight is seen as passive. The one who doesn't clap back is viewed as submissive. The one who remains calm in the face of insult is assumed to have no fire. But maybe they're just holding the fire inside. Because to the average person, raised in a world of ego-driven performance, stillness looks like surrender. Restraint looks like fear. And silence looks like absence. But Nietzsche saw silence, detachment, and calm as the highest signs of inner command. Not because you're ignoring the world, but because you've already transcended the need to react to it. He once said, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." The crowd, Nietzsche believed, misunderstands power because it's conditioned to associate movement with meaning. We've been trained to think that action equals strength, and stillness equals indecision. But often the opposite is true. Think about a chess game. The beginner moves constantly. The master waits. That waiting, that calculation, that patience is not weakness. It's anticipation. It's dominance in slow motion. The same dynamic applies to life. When someone insults you and you don't respond, the crowd might see you as defeated. But what they can't see is your refusal to be pulled into a game you've already outgrown. This is the paradox. In a world where power is measured by visibility, the most powerful person is often the least reactive. They don't need to defend their name in every comment section. They don't argue to correct every false assumption. They don't collapse under misunderstanding, because their sense of self isn't built on other people's opinions. But that kind of self-possession is threatening, because it can't be controlled. It doesn't need applause. It's immune to manipulation. And so the crowd misunderstands it. We've seen this in history. Socrates refused to defend himself in a way that would appease the court, and he was sentenced to death. But his calmness shook the very foundation of Athenian pride. Jesus remained silent before Pilate, not because he was powerless, but because he had already made peace with what came next. That silence has echoed louder than any defense ever could. Even Nietzsche himself, misunderstood, mocked, dismissed, became a prophet of ideas that only made sense long after the crowd had moved on. Because the truth is, the crowd doesn't reward depth. It rewards performance. But performance, Nietzsche warned, is the death of authenticity. So what happens when you stop performing? People get confused. They misinterpret. They question your motives. But deep down, they feel something. Something steady. Something they can't explain but can't ignore. That's the mark of real presence. It's not how you enter the room. It's how the room changes once you do. And more often than not, it's not because you said anything, but because you didn't have to. So the question becomes, do you want to look powerful or be powerful? Because they're rarely the same. Real power isn't recognized immediately. It's often misunderstood, resisted, even ridiculed. But that's part of its design. It's not made for the crowd. It's made for those who see beyond it. Nietzsche's vision of strength wasn't about domination. It was about elevation. About living on a level that no longer depends on being seen, validated, or applauded. And that's the paradox. To the crowd, you may seem invisible. But from the mountain you've climbed within, their opinions look very small. So the next time silence is mistaken for weakness or detachment for indifference, remember, you don't owe the world your reaction. You don't need to prove your fire to anyone. The fire that burns in stillness, that's the one they fear most. And maybe that's exactly what power was always meant to look like. What we've explored here isn't just silence. It's sovereignty. Not the kind granted by titles or applause, but the kind that begins the moment you stop reacting. The moment you realize that stillness is not the absence of motion, it's the mastery of it. Nietzsche didn't want you to become passive. He wanted you to become precise, to speak when it matters, to walk away when it doesn't, to rise above the games that the crowd plays, not because you're better, but because you've outgrown the need to be noticed. If you made it this far, maybe you already feel it. That strange clarity in your chest. That quiet pull towards something deeper, harder, truer. You're not here by accident. You've listened, not just to these words, but to something within you that's tired of being loud. Tired of proving. Tired of performing. Maybe now, you're ready to hold your silence like a sword. To see how much power lives in not responding. To find that the strongest version of yourself doesn't need the last word. Only the last decision. And if this stayed with you, even a single sentence, then let it echo. Leave a comment, not out of habit, but if something inside you moved. Share this with someone who, like you, is learning to speak less and see more. But more than that, carry the silence with you into the next conversation, into the next argument you choose not to have, into the life you're still becoming. Because silence is not the end of something. It's the beginning of who you were always meant to be.